So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our distinguished speaker today is Professor Brian Cantwell Smith. He is the Reid Hoffman Professor of Artificial Intelligence and the Human at the University of Toronto, where he is also Professor of Information Philosophy, Cognitive Science, and the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, as well as Senior Fellow at Massey College. As you can see, he's an exemplar of an interdisciplinary scholar, and every department pretty much at Toronto seems to want him to be jointly appointed. He holds a BS and MS and PhD degrees, was almost a lifer at MIT, but escaped. From 81 to 96, he was a principal research scientist at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center and adjunct professor of philosophy at Stanford University. He was a founder of the Center for the Study of Language and Information at Stanford University, a founder and first president of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and president of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. From 1996 to 2001, he was the professor of cognitive science, computer science, and philosophy at Indiana University, and then he moved on to a distinguished professorship in philosophy and new technologies at Duke, again with appointments in philosophy and computer science. One reason why I'm recounting his various appointments is to really show you and to give you a sense of preview of coming attractions that, he really is a scholar who has thought very, very deeply about, has been at the forefront of AI since the first wave, or even before the first wave, and has thought deeply about the philosophical implications, the ethical implications of AI. And so he moved to the University of Toronto in 2003, and from 2003 to 2008, he served as the Dean of Faculty of Information. So his research focuses on the philosophical foundations of computation, artificial intelligence, and mind, and on fundamental issues in metaphysics and epistemology. In the 1980s, he developed the world's first reflective programming language, 3-Lisp. He is the author of On the Origin of Objects, and On the Promise of Artificial Intelligence, Reckoning and Judgment, which is his recent book that just came out. His intellectual arc and research interests are truly interdisciplinary, and as the brief bio that I gave you attests. Today, he will be talking to us about what AI is, what it is not, what it is capable of, and what its limits are. So, Professor Brian Cantwell Smith, absolutely delighted to have you here.
It's great.
Look
It's
forward
great.
to your talk.
Thanks so much, Priya, and Ty, and the Frankie program for this invitation and a chance to come speak with you. You people have been so generous and welcoming, and it's really, it's just wonderful. It's my honor, and I appreciate all of you giving up an hour or two of your afternoon as well to think about some of these things together. I do want to talk about Reckoning and Judgment. It comes from this little book I published. This book was supposed to be a paper. Terry Winograd, who some of you will know, even when I was a graduate student, he said to me, look, Brian, what you think is an email should be a paper, what you think is a paper should be a book, and what you think is a book should not be written. And the book I was working on then is still not out, and I think he might have been right about the book part. So we'll leave that aside. This is a paper that happened to come out in the form of a short book. And why did I write this book? Well, because it seems to me there's a difficulty in the current debate about AI, which has risen to such prominence in recent years. And here's a way of caricaturing it. If you think about the depth of the understanding of technology and of people that participants in this debate have, there's some people out here who I think actually have a pretty good understanding of the technology and the implications and so on and so forth. Bosterman, Kurzweil, Tegmark, and so on and so forth. Some of you probably know their names. My sense is their understanding of the human condition is like a millimeter deep, unfortunately. And the problem is, of course, there are people who have a much deeper understanding of the human condition. Kant and McIntyre, I take people who have actually passed on so that I'm not quite taking their names in vain. But you perhaps know such people, even people maybe in your families and so on and so forth, who have a real sense of what humanity is and don't think technology is there yet. And then, of course, there are people who don't really have much of an understanding of either, which there are always those. But what is missing is the upper right quadrant. That's what I have felt there isn't enough of a sort of serious debate about what is going on and what matters about it and what it's going to do and what it's not going to do and how we can think about it. that's kind of there. So this book is attempted to say that and to make a stab at articulating a few thoughts about the upper right quadrant. And in particular, I want to think about how to think about AI and people and so on without doing a whole lot of things, without considering it to be a contrast between people and machines, because that way I think lies madness. Lots of reasons for madness. Partly there are people, some of whom you will know the names of, who actually don't think we should be imitating with our AI. I mean, it's not that the human condition should be vaulted into prominence as, in fact, a locus of unexcelled saintliness, I think. But also, I don't think AI is stable either and stuff. In fact, characterizing the debate in terms of people versus machines, in fact, is ideologically, it's just wrong. What we need is a theory of intelligence, an account of intelligence, at least a map of intelligence, in terms of which we can non-circularly assess what kinds of intelligence do AIs have now, what kinds did first wave AI have, what's happening in the second wave, what's maybe possible in the third wave or in the future, and also what kinds do people have, and what kinds can we be expected to have in the future, because there's no reason to think that human intelligence is going to stay put. Just as the rise of writing, everybody who is a historian documents this, that what it was to be human and so on and so forth, didn't remain unscathed by the development of writing and print and stuff. There's no reason, I think, that the sense of what it is to be human will remain unscathed by the development of artificial intelligence either. So I want basically a map in terms of which to give some cartography to these developments. And in particular, this not being a mystery story, I'm going to actually make a distinction between two things which are, I think, characteristic ways of being intelligent. And I'm going to divide them, and I'm not going to use the word intelligent anymore. It's not like, I actually am not sure the word intelligent is useful with respect to the debates about what AI, or it should probably be called SI for synthetic intelligence. But anyway, what is, I want actually some more specific terms that I think we can understand things better in terms of. So by reckoning, I mean what? I mean the manipulation of representations and data and so on and so forth about the world by systems that are not themselves responsible for the relationship between those representations and what they're about. In other words, things that can't hold the representations to account, which I think is really crucial. And this is the kind of information processing that computers excel at. It's characteristic of GoFi database programs, simulations, and so on and so forth. And what I'm going to argue today is it's characteristic of deep learning and machine learning and second wave AI as well, that we haven't passed past reckoning systems. And I'm going to contrast that with what I call judgment, an ideal normative standard to which we humans should aspire. And just a comment, I think I've got a slide here. Yeah. Normative is a tricky word. It's used in philosophy for something of value. It's also used in social science for the thing that establishes the norm, so with respect to which abnormal things are ab. And I have colleagues who are social scientists who say, look, norms are bad, which is a wonderful statement because it's such a normative statement in the philosophical term about the sociological notion and so on and so forth. But anyway, just for clarity, I don't mean to call anything abnormal. I just mean what is worthwhile and that we should strive for this. What do I mean by it? Dispassionate, deliberative thought. By dispassionate, I don't mean not passionate. I mean passionate, compassionate, and dispassionate. Basically, impartial, right? Something that is not, torqued by your own mishigas, basically, not self-indulgently emotion-laden. Careful, deliberative thought that universities, I think, ought to be the locus of stewardship for, and to the extent Yale is, I honor Yale and all of you. Grounded in ethical commitment, responsible action, accountable to the world, and appropriate to the situation in which it's deployed. So for example, if you want to hire a babysitter, suppose you thought this talk was worth traveling hundreds of miles for, and you left your kid in the Berkshires or something and with a babysitter for 3 days, and you decided to drive down to Yale and stuff, and you have a good few days here, and you go back, and you say, okay, where's my 2-year-old? And the babysitter says, well, I don't know. I haven't seen them for a couple of days, but I did everything you told me. That's not good enough, right? It's not just that it's not good enough, it's that you can't say everything that is in fact what it is that the babysitter should do. You want a babysitter with good judgment, not someone who is a literal responder to instructions. So for example, suppose you were to say, look, don't hand the baby over to a strange man. That seems like a reasonable thing you might want to say, except maybe the apartment building they live in starts to burn down, or you can't get down to the lobby anymore, and fire truck drives up with a hook and ladder truck, and the firemen smash the windows, and there's a guy there and says, hand me the kid first, I'll take it down, and then I'll come back and get you. We've only got a few seconds. And you say, well, no, I'm not supposed to give the child to a strange man. That's not right either. In fact, there's nothing you can say by way of list of criteria for the babysitter, in virtue of the following of which that babysitter would be a person of good judgment. That's a very serious fact, and this is why you want young adults to take care of your kids. So that's what I mean by judgment something, what it is to have judgment in the sense of having good judgment. And I think one of the things that is true about such judgment is that it knows the difference between appearance and reality, it knows the difference between representations it uses and the things in the world that those representations represent. It's committed to its own existence and to the world's existence and so on and so forth, basically, and it defers to the world, that it knows the fundamental axiom of science, I guess, that when word and world part company, in other words, when your ideas and the world part company, the world wins, right? You change your ideas to match the world. There's a kind of deference to the world that I think undergirds science. And I think it undergirds basically having judgment. And it should undergird human relations, I think, as well. We were talking a little bit about this at lunch, the thing we all know of what it is to have gone out with someone in the past who was maybe in love with you, but was in love with their image of you, but not with you. And their love was actually attached to their representation of you. And it drives you crazy. You have to leave such a person, because you want to be with someone who's committed to you, not to their image of you. And if their image of you is wrong, they should update their image. Or actually maybe stop being in love with images altogether and actually just be in love with you. That constitutes being an adult. I think all of these things are true of anything that knows what they're talking about. And I actually will argue that we have yet to build a computer system that knows what it's talking about. Okay, so here's what I'm going to argue. Deep learning and other second-wave AI systems, convolutional neural networks, systems trained by reinforcement learning, and so on. I mean, all the recent stuff that you've heard about. They're incredibly important. So in this way, I want to side with the people out there on the right-hand side of the graph. Their power is enormous. I think it's going to only increase. I think the transformation of the human condition that they will usher in is much bigger than a lot of humanists believe. But nevertheless, none of the things that are part of second wave AI will lead to judgment. And I also don't think anything that is being proposed for third wave AI is going to lead to judgment either. So causal models of the world, the stuff that Josh Pengio, for example, at McGill, one of the godfathers of second wave AI, he's working on causal models. Nor will proposals for dealing with context, which is what DARPA is actually promoting, is actually what's the next big thing we need in AI. Nor anything else I have seen proposed for third wave AI. I don't think any of those things are going to lead to judgment. So that's really the kind of tough lesson of this. But then there's a question, okay, well, if none of these things will lead to human judgment, or to judgment of any sort, which humans at their best can exemplify, why is it that this stuff is important? And I think second wave AI is important because it gives us indirect but compelling evidence about the nature of the world, namely about what it's like out there, about the ontological structure of the world. And I think there are lessons there that we need to learn, and we could ignore at our peril, and that first wave AI didn't actually recognize with enough humility. So nevertheless, they won't lead to judgment. So I want to look at second wave AI a little bit from the perspective of reckoning and judgment, and actually ask what these systems can in fact do, and sort of by implication not do, but we'll get to that in the third part. So here is a way, perhaps familiar to all of you, that deep learning is characterized. Lots of nodes with lines connected to other nodes, and so on and so forth. My sense is, I think this has a property of what I call retrospective clarity, which is it is clear to people who already know what deep learning is and conveys nothing to people who don't. That's a kind of writing I used to excel at myself. Here is a better form of characterization of deep learning, I think. The deep learning are systems that do statistical classification and prediction of patterns based on often quite a lot of sample data, using an interconnected fabric of processes arranged in multiple layers. Now, I don't know if we exhumed Kant, for example, and said, what's this new stuff? Or Heidegger and said, look, you're right, rationality, scientific rationality is not Dasein. Here's what Dasein is. It's statistical classification of patterns of, based on something. I don't think it would communicate much to him either. So here's a third shot at characterizing deep learning. And I'm doing this by contrast with GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, as John Hoagland dubbed it. If you don't know anything about computing, you can think of it as logic. Formal logic is roughly the same. It had an idea that human reason was constituted by deep, many-step inference, by a serial process, one stream of consciousness or one computational process, or perhaps a few of them, but not a lot, using modest amounts of information involving a relatively small number of strongly correlated variables. So if we say Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, there are very few variables in that. There's Socrates, which is a constant, and being mortal and being a man, two predicates. That's it. Not a lot. And they're very strongly correlated. And or and not and implies and stuff are extreme strong correlations between things. So like formal logic, classical views of rationality, standard programs and stuff. And deep learning is the opposite in 5 dimensions. So any of you who's a good programmer should be able to now generate a space of 32 different possibilities and put these two things at opposite corners and come up with lots of other architectures. But anyway, it's basically shallow inference, just a few steps, by a massively parallel process, using massive amounts of information involving a very large number of weakly correlated variables. Now, what does that mean? Why is that crucial? Well, if I recognize people, any of you next time, like Priya, for example, and I say, hey, there's Priya. So suppose I'm in Manhattan and I run into you on the street, and then I say, hey, Priya's walking down the other side of the street. And the person says to me, well, look, you're a computer scientist. How do you recognize that that's Priya? I can't tell you. Which is going to be immoral for explainable AI, I think. One of the things that people are coming to realize, I think, is that the way we recognize faces is not by the thing on the left, saying, oh, there's certain eye color, and there's certain skin color, and there's certain height, and there's certain whatever, and saying, therefore, it's Priya, or it's my partner, or whatever. There are thousands, maybe even millions of microvariables, which are extremely weakly correlated with each other. But what the statistics of second-wave AI have shown is that lots and lots and lots and lots of weak correlations can sometimes lead to strong conclusions in a way that's inaccessible to intuition, which is an interesting fact. And these systems are very good at coming to the conclusions that are weakly implied by huge numbers of very weak, that are reasonably strongly implied by huge numbers of extremely weak correlations among a gazillion different variables. That's what's going on with all the data mining and so on and so forth. And that's proved enormously successful in realms that first-wave AI was bad at. Face recognition and reading X-rays and lots of things. But okay, so that's good, and I guess it's good. It's proved successful in certain cases. But the question is, why has that proved successful? And I think the answer to that has to do with this thing I said at the beginning, which it has to do with the nature of the world out there. So here are some examples. This is a room that, I was in this room. This is a picture from 1972 of the room that Shaky, which was one of the most famous of the first, Brian here, I don't know if were you ever in this room with Shaky? Once, yeah, anyway. So Shaky was this is Shaky actually on the wheels. Shaky didn't have to see Shaky. Shaky just saw these 3 other objects. And this whole set of computer was just the peripheral driver. The computer itself was a big, huge mainframe and occupied a whole room that was on the end of that cable. This is much less computing power than nowadays. This was the room that Shaky could deal with and could barely deal with. Here's a picture that I snarfed at random from the internet of another room with like 2 or 3 things in it. 2 people and a table without much on it and stuff. And you can parse this image. This is a more realistic picture than the previous one, a more realistic environment. You can parse this with no trouble at all. But here's the problem. You have just looked at this image in the sense that light has reflected off the screen and gone into your retinas and been processed by your brain by a device consisting of 100 billion elements with 100 trillion interconnections that has been honed for the explicit purpose of actually understanding pictures like this with 500 million years of training, namely your brain. So there's an interesting question. What does this picture actually deliver to your eyes such that, in fact, that's what this incredibly device has, in fact, processed, such as to give you an image of this being a picture with a guy standing in a kind of table and a not so happy woman standing in a window and stuff. I asked a painter, I didn't ask, but we did this with a very good friend of mine who's an artist, an amazing artist actually in Madrid, at a place called Facta Marte. But anyway, he painted a picture of what he thinks the world looks like in the following sense. This is what, okay, the problem is you looked at this image with that same 100 billion element with 100 trillion connections and so on and so forth too. You can't, there's no way to get you to see what it is that your eyes are seeing in the other picture. It just can't be done. So he tried to paint something that I'll put it down here for the technical people among you. If perception computes function f of some input, then this is the artist's conception of f minus 1 of the input, so that in fact if you process this with your brain, the result delivered to your consciousness will actually be what it is that he thinks the world looks like prior to brain processing. Okay, got that? That'll be on the quiz. Now I've been in the place this is a picture of. I've seen it too often to not be able to read it anymore. I don't know how many of you can read it. See if this thing works. Okay, so here's a guy walking across. There's a door here. There's a pail here with some sticks in it. And in fact, inside the door, it's in a basement. There's a sort of crate there with a bunch of sticks coming out of it. This is a couple of portable movie screens that happen to be piled up against the wall and so on and so forth. Over here is, I think, a bag of carpentry equipment. There's a cell phone on the door there and so on and so forth. So I don't know if you can see that or not. The lighting's not so great here. But the basic point is that perception involves parsing and rendering the world intelligible in a way that is absolutely non-trivial. And the sort of conceptual understanding of the world we have, like there's a person, there's a table, there's all this kind of stuff, is the result of a huge amount of quote-unquote intelligence. So here's an analogy. This is a photograph of some islands in Georgian Bay, which is a place north of Toronto where, as it happens, I have a cottage, although I promise you my cottage is not in this picture. There's a lot of islands up there. They say there are 30,000, although there's a proposal to say the number should be 40,000, because nobody quite knows. Here, though, I've done something. I've cheated. I've made the water opaque. Here is the actual photograph, which shows the submarine structure. And this is, in fact, what this archipelago is like, which is there's just this incredibly variegated underwater structure, some of which happens to what's the right word? Poke up above the water line. And my sense is that the objects that we have names for, the kind of conceptual ontology is the word I'm using it for, the objects and properties that we tend to write about and think about and have science about and so on and so forth, are in fact the things above this conceptual level. But the way we recognize the world is not just conceptually. We recognize it by actually understanding all the submarine, namely all the things that I'm analogizing to the submarine structure. So that is to say, just to repeat that, the objects, concepts, categories, and stuff that are represented in current database entries, in symbols and knowledge representations, in logical formula that we have words for in natural language, and that naive realism and GoFi, first wave AI, took to be the fundamental ingredients of the world, aren't fundamental ingredients of the world. They are high-level abstractions and idealizations that privilege some information, deprecate other information, cluster and clump and coarse grain, that's a word that's used in computer science, classify according to interests and so on and so forth in ways appropriate to the projects at hand. This is something that science studies has talked about a lot, but I think it's just the pragmatist too. So suppose we decide to climb all the 8,000 meter peaks in the world, and we're at the top of K2, and you say, okay, this is our final one. I brought this champagne. You're going to pop up in the cork and celebrate. And I say, no, look, first of all, the bottle's going to explode at this altitude. But But secondly, there's another peak 800 feet over there that's also, there's a little bit of a peak. That's got to be over 8,000 meters too. We should go over there and climb that. That's not right. That's not considered an 8,000 meter peak, because the idea of a peak with respect to climbing the 8,000 meter peaks is in fact specific to mountain climbing and so on and so forth. It doesn't just mean all the local maxima, which is maybe relevant for something else, like possibly watersheds and stuff. But the point is, I think, conceptual ontology, not just the concepts, but the properties and the categories and the objects, the identity of objects themselves, are in fact perspectival. They build in commitments and perspectives, and so they're inevitably, quote unquote, biased or skewed and so on and so forth. That's just how it is. That's what it's like to be in the world and to make sense of the world without drowning in its detail. But another analogy, I have analogized the words and concepts, all this conceptual ontology stuff, to the long-distance trucks and interstate highway systems of intentional life. Intentional just means mental here. They are ways of, this is a word I use, registering the world, finding the world intelligible. I think they're crucial for anything like general intelligence. I don't think a robot or an AI system or a person or anything like that could in fact navigate the world without registering it in terms of conceptual ontology, because it sheds so much detail that you can in fact have a chance of reaching out across space and time. Critical given our finite resources to integrate the world into a cohesive objective world. Critical for us to communicate with others so that I don't say, oh, look, I had an old idea on the way to work this morning. Can I actually get a Thunderbolt 17 plug into your spinal cord and I'll download 127 gigabytes of data, which is my little idea. You know, it just doesn't work like that. I also think they're critical in order to plan, imagine, hypothesize, envision, and so on and so forth, things that are crucial to you know, this Popper phrase, we think so that our hypotheses can die in our stead. I think it's a great comment, right? Like, if I were to cross the highway right now, but look, it's clear, but actually there's a truck coming at 80 miles an hour, it's just over here and so on and so forth. Imagine if I tried to cross, it'll wipe me down, so I'm not going to cross. So your hypothesis of crossing has died, but fortunately you're still safe, right? That's, I think, a crucial thing about imagining, and imagining requires not thinking about the world in all its detail, or you would actually never get across the street. So, conceptual ontology is important, but the cost of the putting into the semi-trucks and interstate highway systems and stuff is that you shed so much detail that you can't actually live locally. And I think the actual amount of detail you need in order to pick up a bottle of water or a cup of coffee or shake hands with someone or get out a door and so on and so forth is stupefyingly more than you can capture in words. So here's sort of a picture of logic, databases, first wave AI, and so on and so forth on the left. You've got these conceptual categories connected by a few lines. And I think human thought and communication is kind of like the thing on the right. They have all kinds of submarine structure that is vastly, complicatedly interconnected. And that's how we recognize things. And also, this is the, so what's my point? Second wave AI, I believe, machine learning and so on and so forth, is a computational technique that hangs on to the submarine detail so that it can do a better job of perception, and so that it can do a better job of moving around between the islands, between and among the islands. In the fall of, I'm going to get this wrong, was it 2017 or 2018? I'm not sure. Google changed the algorithm underlying Google Translate without public notice from the previous version to using Jeff Hinton's deep learning-based connections between and among words, where each of the words was interconnected with thousands and thousands, maybe 100,000, maybe millions of others, and so on and so forth, with weak connections. And everybody noticed that Google Translate got vastly better. And I think the point is that with respect to most terms in language, the interconnections that actually render things sensible are submarine interconnections that you can't give voice to, but in fact, if you have any common sense, you will actually realize. So this is actually, I'm going to pass by this. This is a sort of idea about what third wave AI might do. But the point is this. Okay, so the world is kind of like that. And given that the world is like that, it makes sense that second wave AI would prove powerful with respect to, in fact, responding to those kinds of submarine interconnective tissue so as to be better at things like recognition, for example, on your cell phone and stuff. But I think these are still reckoning systems. So this is the third part of the talk. I think these systems, the second wave AI systems, don't remember what my characterization of second wave was. They can't take responsibility for the relationship between those representations and the world that they're about. I think that takes judgment. So what's judgment? Here are 7 criteria that I think a system has to have or meet in order to be able to have anything that I would count as legitimate judgment, in order to be able to have that kind of what I'm taking to be the substantive notion of intelligence. First of all, systems of judgment have to be intentionally directed. So intentional is a philosophically technical term that for now you can just think of as mental, maybe. They have to be directed towards the reference of the representations, not merely towards the representation itself or to the internal state or the causal surround. So you probably know this, that I don't think there are any pets that if you point, I mean, they can respond to things, but they don't actually know that if I point, it's not my finger that's of interest, it's where I'm pointing to, right? That sense of directedness of pointing. The thing that's interesting is if I say, look, there's a fire in the lobby, your mind will direct itself towards that fire, and you'll sort of think, oh goodness, I better not go at that door, I'll go at this one over here, something like that. That's how we refer to things. If I refer to the ceiling on the paint flaking off the ceiling on the examining room in the clinic that Mother Teresa used in what was then called Calcutta, all this kind of stuff, you can direct your mind towards that. You can direct your mind to all kinds of things. If you think you need to get home today by 6 o'clock, then you're going to direct your mind to traffic and maybe get out of here earlier and so on and so forth. You can't imagine thinking without your thinking being directed towards something. That's basically what thinking is. The thing that's interesting about this kind of directedness, what the really complicated philosophical term for is aboutness. You can't detect this physically. It's not something a video camera will capture. It's not a form of causal interaction. That's a sop to why I disagree with Karen Barad, for any of you who are Barad fans. The can't be captured on a video camera is for Bruno Latour, who actually thinks that video cameras can capture everything of relevance to science studies. I worry that, in fact, reference won't be ever accounted for in any kind of science that is committed to causal explanation, because it's not, in the first instance, a causal relationship. It may be constituted by the total causal relations in the universe. I'm not arguing against physicalism. And it can't be detected. So I tell my undergraduates this. I say, okay, here's an iPhone app. You could build one for Android too. If you build this and market it, you can become a billionaire. In fact, I'm so confident you can be a billionaire that if you build it and market it and you don't become a billionaire, you can kill me. You can take my life. I will put my life on the line with respect to this being a billion-dollar app. The only problem is God said you can't build it. So here's the app. You put it on your iPhone and you load it up and you push a button and start. Then your iPhone will beep every time anyone in the world thinks about you. Now, I think human vanity is such that a lot of people would buy this app. And you could imagine Bluetooth connections to earrings that would glow and all this kind of stuff, right? So my students who are committed causal scientists say, well, look, of course you can build that app. You just instrument everyone's head and you upload all of their thoughts to the cloud and then you download, you figure out who they're thinking about and you download that to the iPhone and iPad and stuff. And I actually don't think you can do that for a variety of reasons. But the point is, that's not what I'm saying. There's a fact at the moment now as to whether someone's thinking about you. Your partner, for example. But you can't tell Shay you because nothing causally impinges on you, even though you're the object of this thought. So then my students say, well, look, actually, there's no such thing, because if it's not causal, then, in fact, it doesn't exist. So they're not just causal scientists, they're metaphysically causalists. So then I try to get them worried, and I say, look, okay, you've met someone 3 weeks ago, you're going hot and heavy with them, and actually the last weekend, unfortunately, their high school lover came, and they went off to Hawaii for 4 days, and you're just in your dorm room, you're a complete anxious wreck, and you can't sleep, and you can't eat, and you're just a complete mess, and then on Tuesday, your person comes back from Hawaii, and you say to them, did you think about me while you were gone? And the person says, there's no such thing as reference, I just changed around the organization of molecules in my brain and so on and so forth. I just try to get them worried. Some of them are remarkably durable in their denial that thought is about anything. But I think it's actually unimaginable that thought is not about something. And not only is it unimaginable, but the aboutness matters because, for one thing, it matters to the truth of something. In fact, what's the difference between fake news and real news? Or true accounts and not true accounts? It has to do with the relationship between the thing and what it's about. And that's not a direct causal relationship. You can't tell the truth of something by putting a meter on it. There's no sensor that can sit on a sentence and turn green when it's true and turn red when it's false. These facts aren't causal relations in the world. But nevertheless, I think this referential orientation is the most important fact about thought and language. So anyway, that's one criterion. I'd better speed up a little bit. Maybe I'll talk faster. In order to get a judgment, I think you've got to actually have that orientation. And I will say, I don't think any computers are oriented towards anything at the moment. You might say, look, I put a USB key in, and I say, look, erase this USB key. Isn't it oriented towards the USB key? And I think, no, it's not oriented. It just sends some signals out to something that's wired into that drive. But if you take that out and put a different one into that drive, it's going to erase that one. And it's not that you could tell the difference yourself if you were in that situation, but you know the difference. The system is congenitally unable to know the difference between what's in the drive and another thing that looks causally the same to it. So anyway, yeah, there's an issue of whether science, as we know it, can explain the mind. That's something I'm sure we can talk about. Secondly, this registration thing I mentioned earlier. I think you have to find the world intelligible, which means abstracting, skewing, clustering, identifying, and so on and so forth, identifying objects and so on and so forth that are ways that are appropriate to the projects at hand. And crucially, you need to understand it and register it in ways that are appropriate to the commitments and the identity of objects and properties and stuff that underwrite the registration scheme. So that's going to matter. On American Airlines, for example, you're an adult if you're over 2. You're an adult because you need your own seat. If you're doing a study of smoking and children, you say very few children smoke because I checked this database of American Airlines and nobody, in fact, was caught smoking and stuff. Like, that's a different notion of adult, right? You've got to understand that if you're going to actually do this stuff about databases and so on and so forth. There are commitments underlying all the categories. I mentioned this one before. I think to have judgment, you've got to know the difference between appearance and reality, and that means knowing the difference between your own representation and what it is the representation's about, which means you need to know what the representations are about. And you can't just know by having other representations, because then you would just have commitment to other representations. But remember this person you don't want to live with. You want them to be committed to you, not to just another image of you. And I think this gets into John Hoagland and other philosophers. I mean, parts of Heidegger that I think are okay and lots and stuff like that, about discriminating the actual and the possible, the impossible, and so on and so forth. This is a very complex condition. So for example, Priya was kind enough to bring me this bottle of water. If I saw, or in some sense, if my visual system delivered to my head the following idea, that this bottle of water just jumped off and went back down on the table. Now, I'm a good physicist, so I think, well, it must have cooled down because there's got to be conservation of energy. Would I think that happened? No, because it can't happen. I mean, yeah, it could happen if it violated the second law, but it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And in fact, if my visual system delivered to me that impression that the bottle just jumped up and down, I would think I just blinked. In fact, it may have done it. I wouldn't know. I would think I blinked, or I would think I jostled the lectern, or I would think you have a subway underneath this wonderful hall, which you probably don't. Or I would think that whatever I was fed at lunch in this wonderful lunch, actually there was something in it. It wasn't just water and coffee. Whatever. I would make up some story that is possible in the world that explained the fact that I thought something happened that was impossible. Because I have very high standards on taking something to be the case. And you might say, well, look, you should just have a model, a causal model of the world about what is possible. But the problem is that the conditions on being actual and possible and impossible and all kind of stuff are conditions on registration schemes. They're in part. They're not just conditions on how you register this thing in particular. They're conditions on schemes. So for example, that this will have jumped up and cooled off is compatible with some registration scheme, but it's not compatible with other ones. But that, I don't know, it just got infused by, I don't know, what's something impossible? It just turned into single malt. That just can't happen. So I'm not going to entertain that. But it's not part of my registration scheme of bottles of waters that they can't turn into single malt. There's background conditions on, in fact, ways of finding the world intelligible that keeps out what's impossible, which I don't think any computer system has yet. More existential philosophy, I think there have got to be stakes, there's got to be commitment, the system has to care about the difference between itself and the world, be existentially involved in its domain, and so on and so forth. These things are necessary in order for it to know what, in fact, it can take as real. If you can't tell the difference between, if you don't know what it is for something to be wrong, you don't know what it is for something to be right, and if you don't know the difference between something being wrong and something being right, you can't tell the difference between your representation and the world, and you just turn back into a sort of internal solipsist. So the existential commitments, I think, on knowledge this is not my idea. This is really, really serious. I also think you have to hold everything accountable to being in the world. That was one of the problems I had with this little, with the impossible, is that requires a world that there can't be. And what do I mean by the world? I don't mean any single registration scheme of it and any conceptual model of it or anything. I mean the thing that, in fact, conceptual models are models of, which is to say, the world as a whole, right? That which is one. I mean, I could invoke language that would be reminiscent of 17th century conceptions of God. That which transcends all understanding, that to which everything is accountable, and so on and so forth. Except I don't mean God in some sense of different from the world. I mean, the world out there is staggeringly complex, and it is more complicated and more subtle and more nuanced and so on and so forth than I can grasp. But my commitment has got to be to it, and it that I register as a cup, not to the cup qua cup. You always have to have this commitment to that which is beyond how it is that you take things to be. And that's what I mean by resolutely defer. You have to be deferential about the adequacy of your registration schemes. For those who like semantics, I want to say semantics has to be deferential. Needless to say, model theory is not a model of semantics that I think is worthy because it's not deferential. And needless to say, I don't think any computer systems we have built at the moment are deferential like this. And I don't even know that I know how to build something differential. I think everything has to be accountable. I won't go into this. I mean, it's similar. It actually involves being accountable yourself for your own participation in the world, not just for the things being in the world. And you have to have a sense of self. You have to know that you are here, but at the same time, you have to detach yourself from what you know, so as in fact that you can think that these things that you're saying about this thing are true, and they're not just projections of you. So all the models of objectivity in the West about scientific knowledge, and all the models of serious detachment from East, you know, we shouldn't use those words, but anyway, from Asia, I think are both models of how to step aside from your own mishigas, to use that technical term again, so as to let things be what they are without denying that you're located and you have a perspective on them and stuff. That's, I think, giving things their due. That's kind of my philosophy of life, is you should give things their due. And I think that is amazingly hard. And I think you have to give things their due in order to be a creature that has decent judgment. So, something like that. All of those things, I think, are required in order for a system to know what it's talking about. At least for it to know what it's talking about in any way that's really worthy. And needless to say, I don't think anything in first wave AI, second wave AI, or models, causal models and models of context and so on and so forth actually approach this, because I think, like the point about referential orientation, it's not obvious what it takes to have these kinds of non-causal orientation towards the things that you're talking about. So everyone says, look, so are you a mystic and stuff? You don't think it's possible to ever build a system that has judgment. And my feeling is, no, I'm a physicalist and all right. The point is, I think, judgment is unlikely in machines to be an architectural property of a computer system that's identifiable as a local architectural property or identifiable in fMRI. No more locally identifiable than we could locally identify which of your beliefs are true, or whether, in fact, your inference is trustworthy, or your personal reliability. So my dad, just if I can have a personal note here, he was president of the American Academy of Religions, and he was a Christian, but he was involved in working with Muslims as colleagues. He started this Islamic Institute in Montreal, and he was asked on stage, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, "Well, I don't know about that. Ask my neighbor." He didn't say, "Where's the nearest fMRI?" And I think, for an off-the-cuff response, I don't know if he made it up right there, but anyway, it's a pretty good response, I think, to what mattered to him about his, I'm not religious, but his religious orientation is treat your neighbor well. And treat your neighbor well is not an architectural property of the brain. You're not going to find it on an fMRI. And I think for computer engineers, that's an issue, because at the moment we build systems that we can actually sort of understand with respect to the mechanism that goes on inside their skull. But really my point here today is that the properties that actually are the properties that are constitutive of a judgment aren't characterizable in terms of properties that are effably identifiable in terms of properties of the stuff inside the computer skull, basically. Does that mean I'm not a physicalist? No, I think it's probably embedded in, but not theoretically understandable, as extraordinarily complex fine structures of neural patterning specific to particular people and circumstances established through deep cultural embedding and so on and so forth. In general, my sense is that developing the norms and inculcating them in people and civilization or cultures and so on and so forth is a huge accomplishment of the last 10,000 years, let's say, or 40,000 years or something of human culture, is actually figuring out how to encourage these normative standards for people to hew to. So then the question is, can you build these things? In principle, presumably, yes, right? If, in fact, we gave these systems enough guidance, enough cultural embedding, enough education, and enough of an ethical taproot, enrolling a highly complex social configurations, which we've come to recognize as crucial to development, this kind of moral compass, and so on and so forth. So my partner, she's a neuroscientist, and she had a 10-year-old when I got together with her, and when he was like 14, I said to her, look, I don't think, I was saying this to you right before the thing, so that's why I'm coming up with the example. I said, so my father's a theologian, I sort of said, look, I don't think his moral taproot is deep enough. And she looked at me and she said, he's not myelinated yet. So that's what happens when a theologian runs into a neuroscience thing. But she didn't disagree that he didn't yet have an appropriate moral compass to, in fact, deal with situations. And you know what you do with a kid. The kid's playing hockey in the backyard, and they break the plate glass window in the neighbor's house, and the kid's ashamed and never wants to talk to the neighbor anymore. And you say, look, kid, we're going to take my hand, we're going to go over, and we're going to knock on that person's door, and we're going to explain to them. And I know you're terrified, but he's a decent guy, or she's a decent person, and they'll understand, and so on. It was an honest mistake, and I'm going to pay for the window, and so on and so forth. And you're going to say that you're sorry it happened, and so on and so forth. And we're going to do that. And the kid screams, and you say, no, and you hang on to their head firmly. It's a what do they call it? An object lesson or something. It's a point of moral education. What I don't know is what would it be to actually take systems of our synthesis, our construction, through the kind of development that is necessary in order for them to develop this kind of moral commitments. To transcend self-interest, to be committed to the whole, to get over greed and petty jealousy, all this kind of stuff. Something that's been talked about in great literature, as I said, in the world's religious traditions and so on and so forth. I don't think you're going to get a big data training set that's going to generate this. And of course, people can say, well, look, people aren't too good at that either. And I say, well, that's good. That's not good. That's a good point, because in fact, that's why I don't want to characterize AI in terms of people's failings. The point is we want to actually build systems we can rely on. And this is what we as a human culture have come to realize is necessary in order for us to rely on people. And here's a sort of blunt way of asking this. I've asked this to a variety of my students who work in Silicon Valley. What would it be for you to build a system that needs to be educated or raised rather than just trained? And I don't know the answer to that, and neither do they. Okay, so what can we learn from this exploration? Systems lacking in judgment, systems that don't have this judgment that I've been talking about, so everything in GoFi, everything in databases, but also everything in deep learning and everything in second wave AI, I believe, can't shoulder responsibility because, in fact, it's not committed to that which its representations represent. And that's the sort of first step towards responsibility. So they can't shoulder responsibility at all. So therefore, they themselves cannot be ethical or unethical. They can't take responsibility for the registration of the world because, in fact, they don't have any access to the world that the registrations are registrations of. They can't take responsibility for that which they register, so they can't take responsibility for the kid if you had an AI system that you wanted to employ as a babysitter. They can't take responsibility for the data in terms of which they were trained because they have have nothing remotely approximating the capacity to take responsibility for the data they're trained in. So it follows that if we build such systems, we who use them, we have to shoulder all the deference to the world that is relevant to the data they are trained on and use. We have to take responsibility for all the object registrations and registration schemes that the system uses or relies on. That means we have to take responsibility for the registration schemes underlying all of the databases that they're mining. The categories, like sex, one's got gender and stuff, right? There's 5 viable sexes, I think, with respect to X, XY, XYY, XXY, X naught. I'm pretty sure all 5 of those are viable. There's gender, there's phenotypic sex at birth. So in fact, if you're XY, but you don't have androgen receptions, you'll grow up phenotypically female, and you probably wouldn't know that you're XY and all this kind of stuff. So you've got a driver's license, and it just is a one-bit field of male or female and stuff. Right? We have to take responsibility for the violence that's doing to all kinds of different persons. There's a question of whether driver's license should have sex or gender on them, and actually a friend in somebody worked in the lab when I was dean. That's his job at the moment, is to investigate changing the Ontario driver's license to actually allow people to change the field on their driver's license. And the question is, should that field be called sex or should it be gender? Should there be another field and so on? Not a trivial problem. But the point is, we have to take responsibility for all of the categorization that underlies all of the databases that, in fact, systems are trained on. And I, therefore, am not at all convinced that data mining is ethical, because I actually believe that data mining runs rampant over all kinds of databases that I'm not sure anybody has said, look, I'll stand up and take responsibility for the fact that the registration schemes underlying all of these databases are actually ethically compatible with respect to all the purposes that this system is actually going to be deployed in, and so on and so forth. In other words, the successes of second wave AI don't absolve us from any of this stuff. That, I think, is true at the moment. And I think the standards I've tried to articulate for judgment are what it is that a system would have to achieve in order for us to be exculpated from taking all of that on our own shoulders. And then what are the lessons for people? Well, I think we should allocate to AIs all the tasks for which their reckoning prowess suffices. Reading X-rays? Maybe, if the circumstances are right. What about driverless cars? Well, does that require judgment? I don't think that's a question with a simple answer. I think, in fact, if the structure of driving were sufficiently regulated, then, in fact, it could be that reckoning systems would be appropriate for that, and it might be that we'd be much safer than people. The way the structure of flying airplanes is regulated, such that, in fact, computers are, in fact, largely responsible for a lot of the landing of planes. And I'm glad when I fly into San Francisco airport and it's foggy that there are computers in there and not a pilot peering out the window saying, where do you think the airport is? Do you think it's there, over there, and stuff? Yes, we should have computers. But we regulate flying such that computers' prowess is adequate. At the moment, we don't have driving configured in such a way that reckoning prowess suffices. How that will go, I honestly don't know. But I think the point is, what we need to do is, what would driving have to be such that, in fact, reckoning would be enough to make driving safe? And if it's not, we shouldn't actually turn it over to them. So I want vocabulary in terms of which to think that problem, not yet to make a judgment about what it is that would be right. I also think, this is the university, that we should up the ante on educating people so that they shoulder judgment. Not because of the audit culture that unfortunately affects the University of Toronto. I'm sure it doesn't actually affect any of you here. Not actually reduce education to actually train students to be good reckoners, which systems are going to be much better than they are at. But say, look, shuck all of the skills you're taught that actually can be done by reckoners. What that you're doing requires your judgment. And amplify, build that up, nourish, and inspire that in our students. So that's what I want to say. Thank you very much. No, thank you.
Thank you so much for an excellent talk that is forcing all of us to think much more deeply about sort of news items that we are reading about what AI can and can't do. So now we open the floor for questions, and there's a roving mic.
Thanks, Priya. Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
So if I walk around looking blinded, it's actually because I am, because there are big bright lights up there. So sorry about that.
To what extent do you think a system with judgment might need to be local or like situated or embodied, or some of the words I heard?
Right. Well, okay, to what extent? To a big extent. What's the next question? No, look, I don't think rationality is think about the submarine structures, which I think are necessary in order to think well, even think in a reckoning way. In order to have that submarine structure, you've got to be somewhere in the world such that you absorb it and stuff. Take the word laughter. It's actually interesting. On Thursday, I'm giving a talk in Pittsburgh. I'm giving a couple of talks there, but one of them is called Effing the Ineffable. And I think it's basically about how can words give voice to that which words cannot give voice to. Think about laughter. I could say, they laughed at him when he came into the room, or, she's capable of making anybody laugh, and it's so disarming of tension or something. You know what this predicate laugh means. Do you think, laughed of her then? I don't think so. I think laughter indexes for you a vastly complex submarine structure because you have laughed. And I don't think any system is going to be able to actually deal with they laughed that is not itself a system that laughs. And you're not going to laugh if you're not somewhere. I mean, maybe the Oracle at Delphi and God laugh, I don't know. But laughing is something that happens. And think of all the things that have to be true for you in order to laugh. The thing that's interesting, though, about the embodiment stuff. First of all, I'm not a fan of the word embodiment because, so I'm going to have some water now. I'm going to drink from an embodied bottle of water. Right? There's something weird about calling this an embodied bottle of water. It's physical, it's concrete, it's here. But you wouldn't say it was embodied. Why would you not say it was embodied? I think because it would never occur to you that it wasn't. I worry that people who talk about embodiment are actually lapsed Catholics or something that actually think there could be the human soul without the body. So people say, look, you've got to take care of your body. I would say, look, you got to take care of yourself. Because that's you. So it's a funny word in intellectual history, I think, to have taken this thing on to name what I think is a property that is so true that it shouldn't need to be named. But that we have to be concretely here, and that we have to be located in a context, I think is absolutely critical. I don't think it's enough. The problem is a lot of the radical embodiment people want to reduce thinking to concrete causal bumping and shoving around them. And I think they can't think about the pot on the stove that is currently burning up their apartment because they're not concretely connected to it. I think the whole point about reference not being a causal relationship is that it is something that the radical embodiment and situated people are unable to account for. So yes, but is my answer. Someone else? I don't know where the microphone is.
That's fine.
I have to make good on my promise here.
I want to ask you about
Yeah.
the relationship between self and consciousness,
Right.
and particularly in the concept or in the context of animal sense of self in animals and animal consciousness, and to think about that in the context of the possibility of computer consciousness or sense of self or feelings even.
Okay, great question. Here's what I think. I mean, I have a whole story I want to tell about consciousness at some point. This is not that story. Oddly enough, I want to talk to Priya about this theory because it actually relates to the differential equations in physics and so on and so forth, which is an unlikely thing. But anyway, but here's the problem, I think. There is a model of rationality which has been based on first-order logic and theorem proving and stuff, which has been held up as a norm of that's what it is to be rational. And that's, you know, and that involves a variety of things. One is a particular form of moving between propositions. And the propositions are conceptually articulated. And so a lot of people have realized that's not all there is to human mental life. And my worry is that a lot of people have put into consciousness all of the things that that model of reason can't hold. There was a consciousness conference at which David Chalmers, they were talking about qualia, the feel of, you know. And he said, let's start the conference with some qualia. So he put on like a Brahms string quartet for 5 minutes. And I think that's actually perverse. I think there is something about the sound of a Beethoven string quartet that is not capturable in this logicist model of thinking, or in logicist model, logic-based model of perception. But so much the worse for the logicist, logic-based models of thinking and perception, I think. I actually think that they are based on an untenable ontological view of the world, and that consciousness has served as the else clause, under which, a rug under which everything else has been swept. And I think if you develop the notion of rationality that I think is implicit in the notion of judgment, a huge amount of that which gets put into consciousness ends up in this account. That's actually something that, in fact, is necessary to thought at all. Now, one thing you could ask is, well, look, if that's true, I'm not saying you think it's true, but suppose you were to say to me, look, if that were true, does that mean there's no difference between thought and consciousness? And I don't think the answer is no. I mean, I don't think the answer is yes. I don't think it's no either. I think it's complicated, because I think consciousness involves taking the self to be a self, and there's a lot of things like that. So then we can talk about, I don't know, Dan Zahavi, who's a phenomenologist in Copenhagen, who has written very, I think, penetratingly about consciousness and self and so on and so forth. But I think the first order is I want to be careful about the question, because I worry that the notion of consciousness is carrying a lot of stuff which I think is absolutely fundamental. I just am not sure it's helpful to put it under consciousness. Because I worry that then people will say, look, these machines cannot be conscious, but they'll still be intelligent. And my worry is that, no, what notion of intelligence is that? I don't think it's anything more than reckoning. I think anything that deserves to be called thought has to have a lot of what matters to you that you put in consciousness. So that's kind of how I would structure that discussion. And then I would buy you a pint.
Well, I very much like what you said about the implementation of judgment, and I quite agree on that statement at the very end. But I will play the devil's advocate. In genetics, recently, there is this trend where there's a questionnaire that will be asked to a number of people, and a certain, radically socially and culturally constructed trait would be quote unquote measured, like how empathetic a person is or how reckless they are, and they would be assigned a score. And then data mining comes next to find some correlations between some genetic biomarkers and these traits. So how would you respond, for example, if someone tells you, I can actually predict with 95% accuracy from the fMRI if a person would be empathetic to their neighbors or not?
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, if you could predict of a person whether they were going to be empathetic, then I wouldn't be particularly impressed. Because like I said, I'm not a dualist. I don't think the way we are is independent of our physical realization. But what has constituted the development of empathy and what it is to, in fact, be empathetic towards others and stuff, I think the notion is, in fact, a relational notion between us and people in other than us. I don't think you're going to get a neuroscience marker of truth. And I think empathy is ultimately as externally oriented as truth. And also, there's a real question about whether empathy is self-indulgent or not. So, you know, I met somebody who apologized all the time. And I said about them, you know, this is somebody who's apologizing because it makes them feel better. It's not actually, you know, a gesture to the other. I don't deny that there may be markers of this stuff, but that doesn't mean that it's explanatory of what empathy is, or that, in fact, a situation might not call forth empathy, which was not manifested in affective feeling, you know, in physiological. So imagine that you have a head injury or something, and your partner is there trying to take care of you in the hospital, and you might not make it, but you just want to demonstrate enormous empathy for this partner who's going through this hell and may lose you and stuff. You may be incapable of, you know, the neurophysiological expression of empathy that those tests would mark, but it may be that you can recruit other ways of expressing the empathy which you actually feel in ways that the marker wouldn't find. So if you think about the debates about behaviorism in psychology, which this is actually, I think, a replay of. There were people who said, look, you could tell things by how people behaved. But behaviorism was just outside, right? And basically it was, no, any generalization you're going to come up with respect to behaviorism, you can tell a person something ahead of time such that they don't behave in the appropriate way in the circumstance. And I actually think all this neuroscientific testing of everything is basically internal behaviorism. It's saying you can reduce the human condition to the bumping and shoving and electrical measurements and so on and so forth of all the internal stuff. And I think the fundamental fact about generosity and talking and speaking for the truth and standing for the truth and doing unto others and all that kind of stuff has to do with your relationality to that which is other. And I don't think that which is other is so constant that you can, as it were, parameterize it out into an internal test. I just think it's going to be a shallow marker. Something like that.
Thank you so much. I'm very curious about AI's relationship, about systems of judgment in relations to ethical and moral intersection with nation states and how they monitor or police their populations. And specifically what comes to mind is Google's relationship now with China, developing social currency, which is their current experiment, and how they monitor facial expressions, reading lips, those kinds of things. And what does it hold for us in the future as other nation states kind of accept these kinds of ways of policing their populations?
Well, I might have to buy you a drink before we even get started. The other gentleman, I actually... Listen, I'm actually not an optimist. I'm a romantic, but I'm not an optimist. I worry about these things. I worry pretty profoundly. I think that the transformation of the physical conditions of human life including international, are so profound that the norms and structures and stuff that we've built up in the last 10, 20, 30,000 years, in fact, a lot of them aren't applicable, and we don't have any normative governance on behavior at that realm. I think that, does might make right? We don't typically think it does anymore because we've thought that through with respect to nations. Does surveillance make right? There's no doubt, as the gentleman was asking, there are correlations between and among things. There are a lot of correlations in the world. Is that the real thing? I don't think so. I don't think people in Hong Kong think so. I actually don't think people in China think so either. But, it's pretty interesting. I have a number of Chinese graduate students, and I've talked to this about, and most of them realize that the Chinese state is kind of totalitarian. On the other hand, they think that what's going on in the US is terrible enough that they actually would prefer totalitarianism than the chance their kids are going to get shot in school. And, these are pretty weighty things to weigh the relative demerits of. But I don't think these are good policies. I think they're misconceived, that you can, in fact, get at moral character or something like that from facial recognition. I think that is just more behaviorism. It's a particular form of behaviorism. And behaviorism died I don't know if ignominious death is too strong, but anyway, it's not really respected as a theory of psychology anymore. But I think the discourse of AI is, in fact, feeding into it. And something else I might say is that okay, just quickly. Computer science came out of sort of the rationalist tradition, right? So Descartes comes along and he sort of says, look, there's all this stuff we can figure it out. We'll call that mechanism. The other stuff is rationality. I'm not going to pretend to understand rationality. The mechanism stuff, implying planes and so on and so forth. Big success, bigger success than Microsoft. So it goes and it starts to explain more and more and more. And then people said, well, look, maybe we can explain rationality and stuff. I don't know if you know, but Jeff Hinton, who's the godfather of deep learning, his great-great-great-grandfather was George Boole, who invented Boolean logic. So the norms in his family on what constitutes success are actually pretty high, and he has felt weighted down by these for 30 years and so on. So anyway, just between you and me. But Boole was involved in sort of trying to render the rational into the mechanical, in part. But nobody thought semantics could be rendered. It was just proof theory. It was just the causal mechanisms of thought, not the aboutness. Computer science comes along, and think about the technical terminology of computer science. Data, information, program, identifier, name, reference, semantics, reference to an index array or something. Computer science took all of the vocabulary from the rationalists and translated it into mechanism. So all of what semantics is in computer science is an account of the mechanical relationship between a program and the behavior, the mechanically individuated behavior to which it gives rise. So if I talk to computer scientists about semantics, they think I'm saying garbage. And the problem with that is that I actually don't have any words to speak about that which I want to speak to them about because they've taken my words. So we've got a problem with respect to bringing these issues up in a way that is intelligible to computer science. And I tell you, I have been struggling with this for 30 years. It's not easy. Now you could say, look, forget those words. I've been told by people in audiences, for example, look, just get with the program. It's just over. That's what all these words mean now. Well is my sort of technical response to a lot of things. It's a real intellectual, we are in a battle about the age of mechanism. Because I think computing is interesting because it is not just a mechanical phenomenon. And so this is the last gasp of the limits of mechanism, and the computer science industry, and maybe Google too, are trying to subsume it into a mechanical account. And I think what's happening to the notion of intelligence is the mechanists are trying to render it into a mechanical thing. And that's why I talk to the students about, reference not being detectable, I think it's crucial that we realize that the locus of what matters about us as people is not reducible to mechanical vocabulary. And that it is not implied by being a physicalist either, because that's another thing. It's, oh, you're just a mystical, whatever, you know, you've been out of date since 1482 or something. So there's real stuff at stake here, I think. I don't want to be excessively dramatic. Okay, end of footnote, sorry.
So we're all looking forward to this drink, which the Frankie program is going to buy, so I will try to keep it short. Everything you've said has seemed to be very much at the human scale. Even essentially at the human scale. So I take it to be perfectly okay that you haven't mentioned quantum mechanics.
Correct.
But my worry is that by doing so, what you need to be taking account of is Bohr's view of measurement incompatibility, where, for instance, at the human level, you and I could look at a person's behavior, and I might say, oh, that behavior is acceptable, and you might say that behavior is unacceptable.
Right.
And of course, we're making completely incompatible assessments. My whole history leads me to think that their behavior is acceptable.
Right.
Your whole history leads you, we've both made a binary measurement, which we give the same name to, and yet they're from completely different directions into the same, what we would think is the same behavior. And yet, is there a fact of the matter? Because that's what quantum mechanics says, is that if you are making incompatible measurements, then there is a much more serious question as to whether there is a fact of the matter of what you're seeing. Almost everything you have said here is very much focused on there being a fact of the matter. And I'm not saying, of course, evolution means that I am what I am, because
right.
Yes, there's a world in some sense, but now I'm starting to make this into a comment instead of a question, aren't I?
That's right, that's right. You can just say, do you think that was true at the end?
I suppose you must have been confronted by people who said, what about quantum mechanics?
Yeah.
So I guess, having made my comment, I'd love to know what your response has matured into to people who say, what about quantum mechanics?
Well, I think you succeeded in making your question short. Whether you succeeded in asking a question to which the answer is short is a different question. Okay, first, with respect to there being a fact of the matter, I think facts of the matter actually, I have constructivist sensibilities, as you can tell from my other book and from this book, and so on and so forth. So I think what constitutes truth is, to some extent, it's undergirded by the world, but I think it actually is reflected in an appropriate attitude for us to take towards the world. So, for example, if you and I climb this mountain, and is it true that there's another 8,000-meter peak? It has to do with, in part, with our commitments as well as with the geography. It's not that I'm changing the geography. I'm not constructing a geography. But as to the fact, it's more complicated than that. So I actually have pretty serious constructivist leanings with respect to some aspects of facts of the matter. I don't think they are black and white. I also don't think that things not being black and white undermines the robustness of the categories in terms of which they're framed. So, for example, I think bread is a very useful category in the world. If I say, well, look, what about latkes? What about hot cross buns? What about, I don't know, Oreo cookies? I don't know, something else that has yeast. Pancakes, are they bread? That's kind of facetious to worry about whether, it's like, look, forget it. You've got a PhD, you've been at MIT too long, just get a life. But that doesn't mean, or if I said, look, you think bread's a good category, let's have the opposite of bread for supper. It doesn't have an opposite. But it doesn't undermine, look, everything is bread, right? It doesn't liquefy anything to just smoosh, to say that the boundaries aren't sharp or that they don't have opposites and stuff. I think there's a huge amount for us to learn from the robustness of categories that don't meet the sort of logical conceptions of what constitutes a category. And I think that's relevant to facts and to truth, too. That doesn't address the quantum mechanics stuff. I think why we are the mesoscale creatures that we are is actually an issue of some note. I don't want to pretend we aren't. I do think that two things bear on the way our judgment has emerged, given we are the mesoscale creatures that we are. One of them is the statistical, the overwhelming statistics of, in fact, things at the scale at which we take them to be objects in the course of our ordinary life and stuff. And another thing is that the complexity results in computer science are pretty serious, I think, with respect to, in fact, figuring things out. So there's this wonderful, I don't know if you're, those of you who are computer scientists may get this, otherwise it probably makes no sense, but there's this wonderful hypothesis of what if the world was running the optimal algorithm? So that there was no way to predict what was going on except by being the whole world and waiting until it happened. That's actually the optimal way to figure it out. You know, there's this fantasy that if things are determined, then they must be predictable. But I think lots of scientific results in 20th century science have driven a wedge, an irrevocable wedge between determinism and predictability. So there are facts about quantum mechanics, there's facts about computability theory, there's facts about statistics and so on and so forth that are, I think, relevant to that. There's something else that comes up with respect to quantum mechanics, which people say to me all the time, and actually they tend to invoke Karen Barad here, that look, you say reference is not causal, but maybe it's in causal entanglement, you know, whatever. There's quantum entanglement that in fact transcends space-time locality and stuff. I think it's bloody unlikely. I mean, I think that's a fantasy which is a little bit redolent of excessive physicalism. And then people tell me funny things. They say, look, I've realized something really amazing. You know, that quantum mechanics is conscious. I'm tired. Consciousness is quantum mechanical. And I say, you know what? You're right. Have a glass of whiskey. We'd like ice in it. Here's this ice. You know what? This ice is quantum mechanical too. And not only is it quantum mechanical, because quantum mechanics is true, but why is the ice floating in the whiskey? It can only be explained at the quantum mechanical level. So it's not just that it's quantum mechanical, it's the explanation of its macroscopic properties relies on quantum mechanics. Does that mean I've had a mystical revelation about the ice in my whiskey? Not until I drank it anyway. You know, so what? It's interesting science. But it's not, I've never heard an argument that consciousness is quantum mechanical that I thought made any interesting access to the undoubted fact that the physical basis of consciousness supervenes on top of quantum mechanical properties of the universe. So.
At this point, we should all thank Brian for an excellent.
Well, thank you to you all.